You kneel on scorching sand. The heat bites into your flesh, seeping past skin and bone. Your legs throb, frozen in place, shaking from exhaustion and sun. A heavy metal ring is locked around your throat, tightened so fiercely that even swallowing feels like suffocation. A chain extends from it, binding you to 11 other women. They are close, so close you feel each shift of their bodies, hear every breath drawn in panic. One sobs softly, another murmurs a prayer under her breath, words foreign to you, yet heavy with fear. A shadow passes over your face. The sun vanishes for a heartbeat. Relief comes fast and vanishes faster. Rough hands grip your chin. Your mouth is wrenched open. Fingers force their way inside, pressing against your teeth, scraping gums, pushing toward the back of your throat. You retch. Your body tries to pull away, but the chain snaps taut. He keeps going. He studies your tongue for signs of illness. He pries your eyelids apart, examines your eyes. He hooks a finger inside your mouth and drags your lip down, displaying your teeth like an animal for sale. That is what you are now, though you do not yet understand it. This examination will decide everything that follows in your life. For the man doing it, it means nothing. By nightfall, he will not remember your face. Less than 2 weeks ago, this was not your world. 12 days earlier, you were the child of a local leader somewhere in the Sahel. You woke each morning to your mother calling for you. You knew every footpath between the huts, every place where shade gathered when the sun stood high. You had a name, one that mattered. Your mother is gone. You saw her killed. You kept walking afterward because the men with blades made the rule clear without ever saying it. Stop, and you die too. In Arabic, there is a word for what you have become, jariya. It is often translated as slave girl, but that translation is too soft, too sanitized. It conceals what the word truly means. It means your body is merchandise. Your life belongs to whoever buys it. Your past has been erased. The man steps away and gives a brief nod. Another approaches, carrying a leather bag. You hear coins slide against one another. Metal is exchanged. This is the 3rd time you have been sold in a single month. And where you are being taken, future scholars will spend generations acting as though it never existed. This is the Arab slave trade. 14 million Africans, more than 1,300 years. The duration matters more than the total. No system survives that long without deliberate structure. Only something carefully maintained can endure for centuries. It was a machine designed to erase people so thoroughly that almost no descendants remain to remember. You already know the story of the Atlantic slave trade, ships crossing oceans, chains, plantations in the Americas. Roughly 12 million people taken over 4 centuries. That history has monuments, museums, films. It is taught in schools. Leaders invoke it in speeches. But there was another system, older, longer, and in some ways even broader in scale. The Arab slave trade began in the 7th century alongside the expansion of Arab empires across North Africa. It continued for more than a millennium. Slavery was formally outlawed in Saudi Arabia until 1962. History did not forget this story by accident. Mauritania followed in 1981. These are not distant centuries. These are dates your grandparents recognize. There are people alive right now who were born into societies where this system was still legal. From roughly the mid-7th century to the dawn of the 20th, historians estimate that between 14 and 17 million Africans were seized from their homes and transported northward into North Africa, the Middle East, and the Arabian Peninsula. Some scholars argue the true figure is far higher. Records were fragmented, deaths were rarely recorded, entire caravans vanished without trace. Over a longer span than any other slave system, human beings were moved across routes linking 3 continents. And yet, the story is barely discussed. Why? Because this trade was designed to erase its victims completely, and it succeeded. In the United States today, roughly 45 million people trace their ancestry to enslaved Africans. Their presence is undeniable proof. Their families, communities, and cultural memory keep that history alive. Their continued struggle ensures the past cannot be buried. But in the Middle East, after more than 13 centuries of importing millions of Africans, there is almost nothing. A few isolated communities in Yemen, scattered populations in southern Iraq, a small number of Afro-Arab families in Morocco, tiny remnants where millions should exist. So what happened to them? Historians searched for migration patterns. They searched for missing archives. They resisted the conclusion when it emerged, because the answer is the most disturbing part of this entire history. African men were systematically castrated. This is not rumor. It is not conjecture. It is documented in hundreds of first-hand accounts spanning centuries. Estimates suggest that between 80 and 90% of enslaved African males were subjected to castration. The procedure was performed at designated points along the trade routes. Egyptian monasteries became notorious for it. Coptic Christian monks developed techniques that slightly increased survival rates. Even so, for every man who lived, 3 to 5 died from blood loss, infection, or shock. Some sources indicate even higher fatality rates. Do the math. If a trader wanted 100 living eunuchs to sell, he might begin with 400 or 500 captives. To the traders, this was not slaughter, it was expense. The rest died screaming in the desert. The logic was merciless and effective. Castrated men could not reproduce. They could not establish families. They could not form communities strong enough to resist. They labored, they aged, they died, and they were replaced generation after generation for more than 1,300 years. The women served a different function entirely. They were left intact, kept fertile, preserved for what their bodies could produce. What happened to them is described in historical sources only through euphemism, careful phrasing, deliberate omissions, acts deemed too shameful to record openly. The system required a constant supply. Arab merchants were rarely the raiders themselves. They were businessmen, managers of vast commercial networks spanning continents. They did not storm villages personally. Instead, they built economic structures that encouraged Africans to capture and sell one another. Firearms flowed south. European weapons moved through Arab intermediaries. Alongside them came textiles, luxury goods, salt, precious commodities in sub-Saharan regions. In exchange came human beings. The kingdom of Dahomey in present-day Benin became one of the largest suppliers. Its economy grew dependent on annual raids against neighboring peoples. The Sultanate of Zanzibar controlled East African routes. The Funj Sultanate dominated the Nile corridor. Tuareg groups controlled trans-Saharan passages. African states went to war not for territory, but for people. Captured survivors were marched to collection centers and sold to Arab traders. The cycle reinforced itself endlessly. More guns enabled more raids. More raids produced more captives. More captives increased purchasing power. More purchasing power brought more guns. A machine fueled by human suffering, growing stronger with every life consumed. Villages were attacked at dawn when defenses were weakest. Warriors encircled settlements while families slept. The assault was sudden and overwhelming. Men who resisted were killed immediately. Men who surrendered were examined on the spot. Age, strength, health. Young, strong males were separated for castration and sale. Older men with little market value were often killed where they stood. The women faced a different calculation. Traders inspected them carefully. Age was critical. Girls too young required years of feeding before becoming profitable. Women too old fetched lower prices. The most valuable fell between those extremes. And what happened to women who met those criteria is where this story continues. The most sought-after ages ranged roughly between 13 and 25, old enough to survive what lay ahead, young enough to be exploited for decades.
Physical appearance carried enormous value. Markets across the Arab world operated on unspoken rules that seasoned traders understood without explanation. Specific body proportions, particular facial traits, details so subtle they could double or even triple a price depending on where a captive was headed. Demand varied by region. Preferences shifted by city, by court, by household. Across nearly all markets, women from Ethiopia were considered the most valuable. Their features were widely prized, and captives from those regions often sold for 2 or even 3 times more than others. Those who matched the desired standards were separated immediately. During transport, they received marginally better treatment, not from kindness, never kindness, but from calculation. Injured goods lost value. Protecting an investment was simply practical. Families were shattered at the moment of capture or at centralized holding sites. Mothers were ripped from children, husbands torn away from wives, siblings dragged in opposite directions. Bonds formed over entire lifetimes were destroyed in minutes, with no chance of reunion. European missionaries and explorers who witnessed these separations struggled to put them into words. They described piercing screams, frantic hands grasping for one last second together, final touches of skin, final echoes of familiar voices. Then the chains pulled tight, and people who had shared every part of life were dragged apart, never to see one another again, never to know what became of those they loved. One missionary wrote that the cries followed him long after he left Africa. Even decades later, he said, he could still hear mothers calling out for children who would never answer. No distance silenced those sounds. Those cries rang out across the continent for 13 centuries, and almost no one beyond Africa ever heard them. Then came the desert. The trans-Saharan routes were not measured in miles, but in death. Imagine the distance between New York and Denver. Now imagine walking it in chains, with almost no water, beneath a sun that kills. From collection points deep in sub-Saharan Africa to northern markets, Tripoli, Tunis, Cairo, Marrakesh, caravans traveled staggering distances. Some routes exceeded 2,000 miles. Others stretched even farther. Under perfect conditions, the journey lasted 2 to 3 months. Conditions were never perfect. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth. Daytime temperatures regularly soar above 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Sand heats until it blisters skin on contact. Shade disappears for hundreds of miles. Then, night falls. Temperatures plunge. The same desert that scorched bodies by day could freeze them after dark. The extreme shifts alone claimed countless lives. Water became the most precious resource, rationed with ruthless precision. Camels required water to survive. Camels were expensive. Camels carried goods. Enslaved people were cheaper than animals and replaceable, so water went to the camels first. Whatever remained, if anything did, went to the humans. Lips split and bled, tongues swelled, throats burned, and always there was the knowledge that hundreds of miles remained with nothing to drink. Food was scarce, dried dates, occasional scraps of meat, just enough to keep bodies moving, never enough to preserve strength over weeks and months of walking. Death was constant. Historians estimate that between 20 and 30% of captives died during Saharan crossings. Some caravans lost half their human cargo. Others arrived with losses exceeding 60%. Those who collapsed were left behind. By that point, no one reacted. That was how the caravan knew it was functioning as intended. Stopping to bury the dead slowed progress. Stopping to help the dying risked losing those still alive. The math left no room for compassion. People were abandoned where they fell, too weak to continue, watching the caravan disappear as they waited to die. Over time, the routes themselves became marked by remains. Heinrich Barth, a German explorer who crossed the Sahara in the 1850s, recorded paths strewn with human skeletons. In some valleys, bones were so dense it was difficult to avoid stepping on them. Skulls bleached white by the sun, rib cages half buried in drifting sand. These were not ancient remains. They were recent additions to trails that had been collecting bodies for more than 1,000 years. René Callier documented similar scenes along western routes. He described valleys that appeared white from a distance, not from sand, but from accumulated bones. Gustav Nachtigall wrote of regions where skulls and remains had compacted the ground into something like stone beneath the feet. Hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, over 13 centuries. their bodies scattered across the largest desert on Earth, marking the paths that consumed them, silent proof of a system the world chose not to see. For the women who survived, who somehow endured the thirst, the heat, the cold, the starvation, reaching a North African port meant only that immediate death had paused, nothing more. Survival came with its own cost. Many arrived broken in ways that left no visible scars. Their bodies completed the journey, their spirits did not. What awaited them was not an ending, but a transformation. The slave markets of the Arab world were ancient institutions, refined over centuries into systems of chilling efficiency. By the time European observers began documenting them, Cairo's market had already operated continuously for more than 1,000 years. Over centuries, traders refined every detail of the system. Pricing models, classifications, inspection routines. Each step was perfected through repetition. Buyers arrived from across the Islamic world and beyond. Ottoman elites from Constantinople, Persian merchants from Isfahan, wealthy families from Damascus and Baghdad, Gulf traders seeking household labor. Even Europeans, despite formal prohibitions, found ways to participate through intermediaries and covert arrangements. Markets were carefully organized by category: unskilled laborers in one area, skilled workers in another, domestic servants elsewhere. And in restricted sections, hidden behind screens or walls, women reserved for private sale. The inspection process followed a rigid sequence. To first-time witnesses, the most unsettling aspect was not violence, but calm. The routine nature of it all. Teeth were checked first. Dental condition revealed both age and overall health. Experienced buyers claimed they could estimate how many useful years remained by teeth alone. Skin was then examined for disease, scars, or marks that might reduce value. Hair was inspected for texture, thickness, and length. After that, nothing was left unchecked. Those offering the highest prices demanded the most intrusive scrutiny. The examinations were intimate and invasive, carried out with the same emotional distance a butcher might use when assessing an animal. European travelers recorded accounts so graphic that later publishers often refused to print them in full. One British visitor in the 1830s noted that women were forced to move, turn, and display themselves in ways he considered unfit to describe. Evaluated with the same detached calculation used when judging livestock, prices varied sharply based on origin, appearance, and intended purpose. Women without favored traits sold for relatively modest sums. Those matching preferred standards commanded far higher prices. Young virgins from highly valued regions could sell for amounts equal to several years of a skilled worker's wages. The most expensive transactions rarely occurred in public. Agents negotiated quietly on behalf of the wealthiest buyers. Zanzibar emerged as the largest slave market in the Indian Ocean world. At its height, an estimated 50,000 enslaved people passed through the island each year. Nearly every aspect of its economy revolved around human trade. David Livingstone witnessed the system firsthand. What he saw left a permanent mark. He later wrote that no account could overstate its cruelty, that the scenes were so horrific he tried and failed to erase them from memory. The market officially closed in 1873 under British pressure. Treaties were signed. Public auctions were banned. But the trade did not end. It adapted. Ships moved at night. Transactions slipped into shadow. Sales continued beyond public view, in courtyards, back rooms, private homes. Demand never faded. Profits remained vast, and wherever demand persists, supply finds a path. What happened to women after purchase depended entirely on who acquired them and for what purpose. The wealthiest buyers were building harems. Ottoman sultans maintained collections numbering in the hundreds, sometimes thousands. At various points in history, the imperial harem within Topkapi Palace in Constantinople housed as many as 2,000 women. Provincial governors and lesser nobles maintained smaller harems, scaled to their status.
Even moderately successful merchants often owned several women for household labor and personal use. But the harem was far more complex than the modern image suggests. It was not merely about access, it was about power. It functioned as a political institution, where women competed relentlessly for favor. Giving birth to a son for a powerful man could alter everything. The mother of a future sultan could wield influence rivaling that of ministers and generals. As a result, alliances formed, rivalries hardened, intrigues unfolded quietly behind guarded walls. Poison was common, political maneuvering as elaborate and ruthless as anything in the formal court played out beyond public view.
For an African woman taken into captivity, entry into a harem marked the intentional dismantling of her former identity. She was assigned a new name. Her native language was prohibited. Her faith was replaced. Her past was stripped away, then rebuilt into something functional for her owners. Training was constant. She was taught how to walk, how to stand, how to speak, how to serve. She learned which behaviors brought approval and which invited punishment. Over time, the person she had once been was erased. The woman her family remembered ceased to exist, replaced by someone shaped entirely for possession. A small number managed to navigate this system successfully. Fewer still rose to genuine influence. Qasim Sultan wielded power over Ottoman politics from behind the throne for decades. She began life as an enslaved girl taken from a small Greek village. Harem Sultan accomplished something almost unprecedented, becoming the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. History remembers these women precisely because they were anomalies. The system did not create Qasim Sultan. It destroyed thousands of women to produce a single exception. For every woman whose name survived, countless others lived and died unnamed, used until their value diminished, then quietly discarded. Women sold to less affluent owners faced different futures. Many became household servants with additional unspoken obligations. They cooked, they cleaned, they raised children, and they submitted whenever demanded. There was no concept of consent. Refusal did not exist. Islamic law offered limited protections in theory. A slave woman who bore her owner's child was designated an walad, mother of a child. She could no longer be sold. Her child was legally free. Upon her owner's death, she was meant to gain freedom herself. But law requires enforcement, and enforcement was inconsistent. These protections applied only after pregnancy. Until then, she remained property. Children born from these unions were legally free and often acknowledged. Some rose to prominence. Multiple sultans were born to enslaved mothers, yet the mothers themselves often remained enslaved unless formally freed. Any intimacy was compelled, never chosen. Over generations, these children married into Arab populations. Physical features blended. African ancestry thinned with each generation until it became invisible, until it vanished entirely. This was the final erasure, not only of individuals, but of their descendants, not only of lives, but of any trace those lives had ever existed. And this story does not end here. The Arab slave trade did not conclude with a dramatic declaration. There was no single abolition moment, no emancipation decree, no civil war fought to end it, no clear line where the world agreed it was over. Instead, it receded slowly, reluctantly, piece by piece. Change did not come from moral awakening within the system. It was forced from the outside. In the late 19th century, British naval patrols began intercepting slave ships along the East African coast. The Royal Navy hunted vessels at sea. European colonial administrations disrupted trans-Saharan routes as they carved Africa into imperial territories. Over time, international pressure compelled formal bans across the 20th century. But what remained was not remembrance. What remained was absence. Today, across much of the Middle East, there are almost no identifiable descendants of the millions of Africans taken there. The men were rendered unable to reproduce. The children born to enslaved women were absorbed into surrounding populations. Generation by generation, ancestry dissolved until it disappeared entirely. This silence was not accidental. It was the final result of the system's design. erase the people so completely that no one even knows they were there. There are no feature films telling their stories, no public holidays marking their suffering, no speeches that speak their names. In 2020, archaeologists working in Libya uncovered a mass grave containing hundreds of bodies. Analysis revealed they were sub-Saharan Africans who died in the 18th or 19th century, almost certainly captives who collapsed during desert crossings and were left behind as caravans continued. They had no names recorded anywhere, no descendants to claim them, no living memory, no grave markers, no monuments. Only bones beneath the sand. Silent evidence of a catastrophe the world chose not to remember. The Atlantic slave trade left behind tens of millions of descendants who carry that history forward. The Arab slave trade left silence. 14 million lives erased so thoroughly that even their names are lost. The woman in the market, the one whose teeth were checked, whose body was measured, whose humanity was dismantled piece by piece, we will never know what she was called before her name was taken. We will never know the name her mother whispered, the name her village spoke. She may have ended her life in a Cairo harem, competing for moments of favor from a man who owned her. She may have lived in a household in Baghdad, cooking, cleaning, summoned whenever demanded. She may have faded into obscurity in a palace in Istanbul as youth passed and value declined. She may have given birth to children who never learned her language, never heard her songs, never knew her stories or her homeland. Or she may have died in the desert, her remains joining millions scattered along routes civilization pretends never existed. What we do know is this: nothing about this history survives unless it is carried forward deliberately. She existed. She suffered. She endured what no human being should ever endure. And for 13 centuries, millions like her sustained a machine built to consume them entirely. The Atlantic slave trade has museums, memorials, and days of remembrance. This history has wind-blown sand covering bones no one will ever identify. Remember her not as a statistic, not as a number. Remember her as someone's daughter, as someone who once laughed, as someone who had a name before it was erased. That may be the only memorial these 14 million will ever receive. If this story mattered to you, drop a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments what time it is and where you're watching.